A pergunta que a gente faz agora para os nossos convidados é exatamente essa. Até que ponto que o governo Biden foi, de fato, uma ruptura, ou essa tentativa, esse ensaio de ruptura foi uma real ruptura, e até que ponto ele tem alguma continuidade com o governo Trump, que lhe antecedeu, que era um governo mais intervencionista, e como essa dinâmica, digamos, de uma mudança do Estado americano, seja por enfrentamento de um desafio externo, seja por, ainda enfrentamento da Covid, que de alguma forma fez como mudar as políticas sociais, como isso era primeiro uma continuidade, uma ruptura, Trump-Biden, primeiro Trump, e Biden, e como isso foi levado à frente e como isso foi bloqueado.
I think that one of the things that I think it's dangerous in this discussion is to suggest there is a break with Biden, but it's important to know that the break with Biden comes after. So 2008, 2009 was where all of this started, where the break should have come, and we botched and threw that away. So Obama, sure enough, he did pass, the Obamacare sort of, health reform, but he explicitly didn't even try to get a public health option. So he went for a private sort of solution. He decided not to prosecute anybody in Wall Street, and the fiscal package was really small. So there was no recovery because of his decisions, and the decisions were conscious, and they knew it. And he brought back Biden and Hillary Clinton. So he decided to kill the Bernie insurrection, eventually in 2016, and that was sealed in 2020. So part of the story is that insurrection wins in 2016 with Trump. Trump is the guy that, again, he might be a full populist. He might not be really concerned with many things of working class people, but the changes, including the increase in tariffs in certain sectors and so on and so forth, they do come with Trump. So what's the big difference with Biden is that, fair enough, because of the insurgency within the Democratic Party, because they do have two very close internal elections. They do have Bernie almost winning in 2016 and in 2020, and they have to stave that off. He moves to the left. Here I always like to say, and I would like to hear Josh, the true American in the conversation is, I would say in the United States there are two parties. One loves democracy in the general election, the Democrats, but not internally, and the other likes the democracy internally. They allow any crazy person to win the primary, but then they don't like it in the general election. They prefer people not to vote. So that generates a very peculiar kind of of dynamic, and we ended up with as much as Biden changed things, and he was more concerned. The recovery was faster. The fiscal package, he doubled down and did a huge fiscal package in January, 2021. The eventually the Inflation Reduction Act was less than what he wanted. He wanted the whatever was the name, do big, better, whatever it was.
Build back better.
Build back better, yes. So that didn't pass because, good chunk of the Democratic Party and establishment didn't want. So they have Manchin and Sinema to complain about. But, it was a lot of the establishment didn't want those things. So I think that it is important to note that the changes started with Trump, and that again sets up the dynamic. I think it's true that Biden did certain things that were more important than whatever Trump is trying to do. The most important, think of the labor what's the name of Josh, remind me here, the name of the 1935 sort of the labor relations board.
Yeah, the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board.
Yes, so pro-labor, it allowed for unionization. Not that it's a huge thing, but it allowed for unionization of services. So we have this wave of Amazon and Starbucks being unionized and so on and so forth. So there is a change in that. Those changes, I think, could only be sustained if the kinds of policies that Josh was talking in the first question were sustained. If you really bring back a safety net that gives working people bargaining power, and that certainly has been sort of dismantled very, very rapidly. And part of this is the incompetence of, including the fact that, I should say, last year in the end of the Biden administration, they had the votes to pass in the Senate and reappoint one of the people in the National Labor, Review Board, and they didn't. And now Trump has the majority there. So it's a very anti-labor, not just the Supreme Court and the judicial, but even the the institutions that could sort of protect workers, they didn't. And I say that shows the carelessness of the Democratic Party with respect to that. And I say the other thing that they all vanish. The only person doing something visible in the United States these days is somebody that will not and cannot run for president because he's 83. Is Bernie. So the only thing you have as a response to what's going on in this country is Bernie, and he is filling squares with more people than anybody ever before in the middle of this. So people are still very angry and pissed off, but there is no response from the Democratic Party that it's completely AWOL.
Well, there's a lot to chew on there. So let me just say a couple of things from my point of view. First of all, in terms of the Democratic Party, I mean, the thing to recognize is there is no such thing as a Democratic Party. There's no institution. The United States does.
Travou.
We traditionally think of them, or people in other parts of the world have parties. There is no leadership that can play any role in who gets nominated and runs for office anywhere. In the UK, if you piss off the leadership of your party, you can be deselected. You're not a member of the party anymore. The Democratic leadership, the Republican leadership have no ability to do that. Anybody can run in the primaries in either party, and there's really no real authority from the center. They're both objectively very decentralized systems, even if, as Matias says, there's in recent years been a little more effort by some big players in the Democratic Party to try to limit the scope of the range of people involved. But it's just they're not structures that have any decision-making capacity or any leadership or any real coherence.
The DNC does have a lot of authority, and they do play because they get a lot of resources.
They have a little bit of money. They have no authority, and they don't have that much money. So I think we should not overstate this. I think the reality is a lot of people who vote in Democratic primaries are also very conservative. There's a huge audience for Bernie. That's certainly true, and for AOC. Let's not forget. But some of those people are politically on the left. Some of them may be coming from other places. They just want to see some energy. Somebody who's standing up to Trump in this moment. It's not always clear what people actually. Most people, if you've ever knocked on doors for a campaign, most people or done anything that involves actually interacting with people who are not politically engaged. It's not a hobby for them. It's not work for them. People do not, in general, have a coherent worldview, and I think a lot of the success of conservatives in Democratic primaries reflects the electorate that votes in Democratic primaries. There's nobody pulling strings from the center. That's my view, and it's a lot of hard work to build up some kind of countervailing force that can win those elections. It's not like, if Nancy Pelosi just gets out of the way, then we'll have socialists winning office. It's a lot more work than that. So on that is my point of view. I think in the Biden administration, from my point of view, I mean, a couple of things. I think one thing Matias said I want to just underline, which is that in some sense we got the conversation that we should have had a decade ago. After the financial crisis of 2008, or whatever years we want to put on the financial crisis, 7, 8, 9, whatever. A lot of people said there should be a real change in the economics profession. There should be a real change in economic policy. There should be a recognition that this kind of neoliberal consensus model just doesn't work. Never worked, certainly isn't working now. And that didn't happen then. As Matias said, Obama came in with a very conservative program with people like Larry Summers and Jason Furman, who were his economic advisors. Although Furman is not Summers, he's a little more open, but still relatively conservative people. And you had a stimulus bill that was much too small. And after the first year of the administration, you really had no ambitious economic program at all. You had 60 votes in the Senate in Obama's first year. It was an enormous wasted opportunity. And I think the first 2 years of the Biden administration were quite different from that. you had people in leadership roles who really were open to new ways of thinking about the economy and about the role of the state in the economy in a way that hadn't been the case before. Even people who's, if you look at their resume, someone like Janet Yellen has been at the center of, she spent her whole life, at the center of American policymaking. Her first job was at the Fed. She was an acolyte of Alan Greenspan. And yet, if you listen to the way she was talking in the first year of the Biden administration, it was very different. It really reflected a view that we need a much more expansive role for the state. She said so in almost so many words, that we can't rely on the market to do basic things like figure out where we need investment and where growth is going to come from. So it's a very, very different kind of vision of, that's open to things like industrial policy. And some of that maybe is a delayed response to the Great Recession. Some of it came out of the pandemic, where you kind of stumbled into this much bigger role for the state. Some of it, I think, was picking up parts of the Trumpian project, like strategic trade policy and hostility towards China. If you go back to 2016, you could say, Matias had one category of the two parties. I would say in 2016, you could say, well, we've got one party that really, really hates China, and that's the Republicans, and one party that really, really hates Russia, that's the Democrats. But, the Democrats picked up a little bit of that anti-China stuff from Trump, which I think
Bernie too had that sort of anti-China and industrial policy and trade policy sort of stuff. It was there in the Democratic Party.
It's true, but it got really, and I think that's actually very bad. And I think that hostility between the U.S. and China is one of the worst things that could happen for the world. If that moved towards a war. But I do think that sort of in the internal debates of the Democratic Party, that became a wedge that opened the door towards imagining a much more expansive role for the state. Why, if you go back to earlier, Obama and even more Clinton, the idea that it was the responsibility of the state to figure out what industries were going to be in the United States and which ones weren't, they would have said, that's crazy. That's not the job of government. Let the market figure that out. And so the notion that we have these strategic industries that we need to really foster and ensure that they're successful here, that came from a lot of places, but I do think one of them certainly was this sense of an intense rivalry with China.